Welcome to On the Middle East, Al Monitor's flagship podcast on the big and interesting stories in the region. My name is Amber Zaman, and today I'll be looking at the conflict unfolding in southern Lebanon, where Israeli forces are continuing to attack Hezbollah targets. It is the biggest escalation since 2006, when the two sides were in a full-blown war against the other. More than 500 people, including women and children, have perished in the Israeli attacks, with tens of thousands forced to flee their homes. The war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza is meanwhile grinding on, even as the world's attention has shifted to Lebanon amid fears of a wider conflagration that could pull in Iran and the United States. That is the outcome that hawks within the cabinet of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is hoping for, if not Netanyahu himself. Joining us from Beirut to discuss the situation is Jim Muir, a prominent British journalist who has covered the region for the past 50 years, including as the BBC's Middle East correspondent and as its bureau chief in Cairo and Tehran. So welcome to our program, Jim. It's very kind of you to join us.
It's entirely my pleasure.
Well, this must be sort of like Groundhog Day for you, being that you've been covering these conflicts for nearly half a century now. What distinguishes this latest round of fighting between Israel and Hezbollah from previous conflicts?
Well, I wouldn't say Groundhog Day so much as Apocalypse Now, if you're talking films. There's been nothing really like this. It's the casualties in yesterday's or the most recent round of, or the first day of this onslaught, were horrendous. You're talking about 500 people killed, a lot of them civilians, and well over 1,500 or so wounded in one single day. I mean, this is apocalyptic stuff. The level of casualties has only been equaled by, or in fact, actually not equaled by the port explosion in August of 2020, when you had 6,000 casualties turning up at hospitals, some of which had been damaged themselves. But the death toll was actually a lot less. It was only 200 or 300, whereas now you have sort of 500 killed in a day, and many of them civilians. So it is horrendous. It is, I think, existential on both sides. And I'm talking a bit wider, not just about the Lebanese thing, because the Lebanese thing is really an extension of the Gaza war. Israel has, I think, quite cleverly turned it around. So we're now more or less forgetting about Gaza. I mean, people being killed there every day in numbers, but it's on the back burner. And the ball is actually in the American court in terms of the negotiations for the supposed truce or ceasefire there. The Americans are supposed to be coming up with proposals to bridge the final gaps, etc., but they're holding off because the whole focus is now turned to northern Israel and the struggle with Hezbollah. Israel simply wanted peace. It could have had it with Hezbollah, because Hezbollah started the war in the south on this 8th of October solely in support of the people of Gaza. And it said that as soon as the Gaza thing ends, the war in the south will end. So if that's all the Israelis were interested in, the war would have stopped. They could have made a deal in Gaza, which they're trying to avoid, it seems. Netanyahu keeps coming up with new conditions, which he knows are unacceptable to Hamas. So by turning north, they've successfully put the whole Gaza thing on hold. I mean, the conflict continues unresolved. But meanwhile, it's become pretty much existential with Hezbollah. They seem to be going for broke. It seems to be, we've always said they can't destroy Hezbollah, and I think that stands. They cannot destroy Hezbollah. They would have to come into the country, occupy the whole place, root out every Hezbollahi. And don't forget, Hezbollah is not like ISIS. ISIS are people who came in from outside. They were not rooted in the local community. Hezbollah is, and you could only destroy it really by destroying the Shia community of Lebanon. It can't be done. They tried in 2006 and failed. Hezbollah won that war by not losing. This is asymmetrical warfare. They won by not losing, and Israel, the mighty local regional superpower, lost by not winning, and that's the widespread perception. This time around, it's different because I have the impression that Hezbollah is kind of trapped in the mentality of 2006, so that, our fighting courage, our willing to sacrifice is what carries the day. Whereas the Israelis have gone well outside that box. They're using technology that hasn't been used before. They've clearly got massive superiority. Their firepower is devastating. And they seem at the moment to be going for broke in terms of wiping out Hezbollah's missile capacity and its ability to sort of hit Israel. Now, whether they can actually succeed in getting their 60,000 odd residents back into northern Israel safely is another question. I mean, conventionally, I would say not, because Hezbollah will obviously keep up hitting northern Israel as long as it has any breath left in its body. But the question is, are the Israelis hell-bent on stamping every last breath out of the Hezbollah body? We'll have to wait and see. A big question for me is, what about America? America is enabling all this. It doesn't seem to be blowing whistles and hauling Israel back, as it's capable of doing if it really cracks the whip. But we're not seeing that. We're not seeing that. It's slightly reminiscent of something that the late Labour politician in England said, Dennis Healey, about having a debate with Geoffrey Howe, the foreign minister. It was like having a debate being attacked by a dead sheep. And that's a bit like Israel's attitude, I think, to criticism from President Biden. It's like being savaged by a dead sheep.
Well, there's a lot to unpack here. First of all, you said that Israel is going for broke. Does that mean then, in your view, that Israel will actually send in ground troops? Or is it hoping to finish off Hezbollah just using air power?
I think they'd be very reluctant to put troops in. I mean, they're extremely casualty averse, and they saw in 2006 what happened. I mean, to me, there's a huge difference between 2006 and now. The war, of course, in 2006 was a pretty much full-out war between Hezbollah and Israel. But at that time, the Israelis tried every trick in the book and then finally sent in troops, and they got really badly mauled. And they're very wary of losing guys on the ground. So I think they will use their air power to the max. They'll do as much destruction as they possibly can. They'll try and destroy Hezbollah's entire arsenal of, guided missiles, etc. And they've only just really begun that. There's some reports saying that they knocked out half of Hezbollah's capacity with missiles, but then they corrected that and they said, no, that's not the case. I think guided missiles they've yet to destroy, and there's a lot of other stuff that they haven't managed to get at yet. But I think they'll do their level best to take out practically every Hezbollah missile and rocket they can identify. The question is, will that be enough? I mean, Hezbollah have said from the beginning, we will only stop when there's peace in Gaza, and nobody's talking about peace in Gaza. So they are, by their own rhetoric and by the logic of the war, they are, absolutely committed to kick back as much as they possibly can, as long as they possibly can. So the question is whether that scenario is just going to be allowed to run its course, or will at some stage the Americans blow a whistle and say to Israel, that's enough. We haven't seen any sign of that happening yet.
But you say that the focus has shifted now to Hezbollah, Lebanon, what's going on up in the north. Meanwhile, that battle in Gaza is continuing. Does this shift of focus give Hamas any kind of respite? How does it affect the conflict in Gaza beyond the fact that, as you pointed out, people continue to die every day?
I don't think it affects it all that much, to be honest. I mean, it is continuing. There are Israeli operations every day there, but they're just not getting hardly any mention at all in the media. Very, very little coverage. So I don't think it, all it's doing is distracting away from the efforts to get a settlement in Gaza, which, as I say, the ball was in the American court, but they're not batting it back, because they know at the moment the whole focus is on the north and on Lebanon and Hezbollah, and it wouldn't get any traction at all if they started trying to revive talks. So for Gaza, it really is a Groundhog Day. It's just a day after day of operations here and there. but kept within a kind of, controllable envelope as far as Israel's concerned. It doesn't expect any surprises there, and it probably isn't going to get any. But meanwhile, Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, is off the hook at the moment in terms of pressure to agree to a ceasefire in Gaza. And don't forget, for example, that Gallant, his defense minister, was for a deal in Gaza, but now all of that talk is completely, it's passé.
Well, not only that, I mean, not only is he off the hook, but his ratings are going back up again. So he seems to be off the hook in all kinds of different ways. But of course, the elephant in the room, as they say, is Iran. And Hezbollah is obviously Iran's big regional ally, central pillar of this axis of resistance. What does Iran do in this situation? And what does Israel want Iran to do?
I think some elements in Israel, the more militant members of Netanyahu's cabinet would love Iran to make a forced move to launch some missiles at Israel to enable Israel to have a pretext to have a serious go at Iran and potentially and hopefully from their point of view draw the Americans in. So yeah, the Iranians have a real dilemma because Hezbollah is it's the jewel in their crown of the so-called axis of resistance. If they stand by and do nothing to save their allies and proteges, and the relationship with Hezbollah is a complicated one. It's not just that the Hezbollah is an Iranian proxy that does anything Iran wants. It's not like that, because Hezbollah is deeply rooted, as I said, in the Shia community. It has its own concerns. It has its concerns for Lebanon. It doesn't want it's never wanted a comprehensive war like it's getting now. So can Iran just stand by and see its main ally kind of pretty much rubbed out, or certainly having its wings very, very badly clipped? That is the question. I mean, the American officials are quoted as saying we haven't been this close to a regional war since, for ages, certainly not since the
Well, I
7th of
find that
October.
kind of disingenuous because this is a regional war.
Well, they mean a confrontation between Iran and Israel is what they really
Okay,
mean,
well,
and
yeah.
it is quite possible. Iran doesn't want it. That's been very clear since October. Iran has been trying to avoid direct confrontation with Israel. It's done what it regards as a sort of minimal encouragement of its allies, proxies, whatever you want to call them, to keep up pressure and to be a nuisance, but not to engage in kind of existential struggle, which we seem to have now. So we'll have to wait and see what it's a big test for Iran and for its ideology and for its orientation. They have been making noises about reviving the talks with the West on the nuclear issue, for example. So they're showing signs of wanting to kind of turn a page, if you like. But this is a very big challenge to them, and it's not clear how they're going to deal with it.
Well, the picture you've painted so far suggests that Israel kind of has the upper hand, at least militarily so far. But looking at things from a, diplomatic perspective, and given that, one of the big hopes of the United States was to somehow get Israel to normalize its relations with all the, regional Arab powers, and notably Saudi Arabia. Now that's sort of gone down the toilet, right? That doesn't seem to be on the cards anytime soon. So in that respect, Israel finds itself more isolated than ever, right? And that being the case, what does that mean for Israel going forward? I mean, it's existential for them too, as you said.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's existential all around. And I've actually said that from the beginning, because to understand Netanyahu and his people, you have to realize that their primary goal is to prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state. That is their overall overarching game. And the more they've done in Gaza, for example, the more the world has said, we've got to have a solution. We've got to have a settlement of the Palestinian issue. There has to be a two-state solution. And coming to the conservative Arabs, the UAE, Saudi, and so on, they've all recently said, we're not going to make peace with Israel unless there's a Palestinian state with Jerusalem as its capital, East Jerusalem. So in a way, the Israelis have gotten themselves into sort of the same bind as you had here in Beirut in 1982, when Israel was besieging the city and it squeezed the PLO out under pressure. But was the PLO finished? No, the PLO became a political entity. Arafat ended up back in Palestine as president of the Palestinian Authority. And the PLO's kind of political career, in a way, was kind of boosted. So, so the more the Israelis were hitting in Gaza, the more people were saying, we have to have a two-state solution. So in a way, Israel has got itself onto a track where being on the warpath is the only way to get out of that, you know. I've compared Netanyahu to a great white shark, because a great white shark, if it stops moving, dies. It needs that oxygen. And in a way, if Netanyahu goes back from the track of war, he's going to be trapped in this thing of we have to have a solution of the Palestinian issue, and we have to have peace and things like that, which would be, you know, the end of his career, because there's going to be a big accounting when the war does stop about, you know, why the Hamas attack on 7th October was allowed to happen on his watch. He had built up Hamas, as everybody knows, as a counterbalance to undermine the Palestinian Authority and to split Gaza from the West Bank, and because Hamas is not interested in a two-state solution. So he's got a lot to answer for, not to mention his legal issues. So, as I say, when the war stops, that could be the end of his career. So Israel on the warpath suits him very well. As you say, his popularity has gained. And the Israeli public opinion has unfortunately gone to the right rather than to the left. People are not saying, oh, yes, we must have a solution. Let's have peace. Let's talk to the Palestinians. Let's give them something. It's gone the other way. They want to, you know, the Smotrichs and Ben Gvirs have now become mainstream. They used to be extreme. Now they're mainstream. And they would just love, you know, under the cover of war, to shove the Palestinians out of the West Bank into Jordan, and shove the Gazans out of Gaza into Egypt, and say, job done. We've got it from the river to the sea.
But the accounting, of course, will be on all sides. How does Hezbollah come out of this? I mean, your city in Lebanon, a very fractured country, and Israel has historically exploited those sectarian divisions within Lebanon to its own advantage. How is this playing out domestically in Lebanon, an already extremely fragile state? So much displacement going on now. And let's not forget all those Syrian refugees also, for which Lebanon's been left footing the bill. Where are things politically, domestically in Lebanon now?
Well, there's been, to a certain extent, there's been a bit of a rallying of support, because people are horrified by the level of casualties. I mean, Christians, Muslims, Sunnis, Druze, they were all queuing up to donate blood, for example, on the first day after the explosion started with the pages and so on. People are kind of horrified with that. There is, however, quite a strong trend, especially on the Christian side, of antipathy to Hezbollah and everything it stands for, antipathy to Iran. So there's sort of a quiet satisfaction, if you like, a grim satisfaction at seeing Hezbollah humbled, because Hezbollah has been, you know, it's been the cock of the walk, as it were. It's had, you know, it kind of has a veto block on domestic Lebanese politics. There's been no president for very nearly 2 years now, because Hezbollah is insisting on a certain candidate, etc. So, you know, quietly, there are some people who sympathize, and it could well be that logistically they may be helping the Israelis with things like these bogus phone calls to local numbers, telling even prominent people in West Beirut that they should abandon their buildings and run for their lives. You know, there's a kind of lot of psychological warfare going on. There may be some complicity there, as there was in 1982 when Israel invaded here, in complicity with the right-wing Christian militias. So that kind of strand hasn't fully gone away. But yeah, it will have a big impact on Lebanese politics, but it depends how far it runs, really. If Hezbollah is really has its wings not just clipped but torn off, and is left just a bleeding body, it will obviously have a big impact. It will perhaps leave room for the Lebanese army to become stronger and fill the vacuum in the south and so on. But it's a long way to run before that stage arrives. And the question is always, you know, will there come a stage when the Americans are so kind of horrified by what's happening, or the pressure on them becomes so great they have to do something. It's an election year. It's a very delicate issue in America. They've already had all the trouble with Gaza. There are so many imponderables here. It's such a delicate equation that it's impossible really to predict how it will come
I
out.
mean, it's kind of clever in all sorts of different ways to shift the focus to Lebanon, because I mean, Hezbollah doesn't resonate in college campuses, in the same way that the Palestinian cause does. It's much more criminalized, demonized in the global sort of psyche. So it all boils down to America, is what you seem to be suggesting, Israel's ability to prosecute these wars. And I mean, history suggests that whoever comes to power, not much changes. And of course, the sad reality is also that on the Arab side, there isn't any real solidarity with the Palestinians, any meaningful solidarity with the Palestinians. Jordan, Egypt, they all continue to have, relations with Israel, and not a single Arab state has cut them off so far. Countries like Turkey seem to be taking far bolder steps. So where does this leave everybody at the end of the day? Ordinary people who want to get on with their lives, be they Jews, Israelis, Shiites, Palestinians. I mean, nothing seems to get better, does it, for these people?
No, you're right. It just seems to get worse and worse, which is pretty depressing, really. But it is an extraordinary situation where you have, as you say, the bulk of the Arab world, which is Sunni, basically doing nothing for Palestine. And the only people who are fighting for Palestine are the Shia, Iran and the Shia, who are fighting for Sunni Palestine,
And
It
why?
is
And why? Can you
ironic.
just explain to our audience why that is? Or is it just a cynical exercising in using the Palestinians as some kind of shield lever to justify their own regimes and their own, cruel behavior?
It is quite hard to unpick it, really. Why is it that it's the Shia and Hezbollah who are fighting for Palestine? Why is it that the Sunni Arab states, well, they're tokenistic. I mean, they've said they won't make peace with Israel unless there's a settlement that gives the Palestinians a state, etc. But that's about as far as they go. In fact, under the blanket, the UAE does have relations with Israel. And the Saudis, it wouldn't take a lot. I mean, they're probably also already collaborating in ways, intelligence and so on. So in practical ways that matter. Yeah, it's a big question of why is it that it's Iran, and is it all about Iranian influence and so on? Maybe we're going to be moving into a new phase where Iran is curbed, where perhaps it changes its tune and rejoins the family of nations or whatever. Or is it going to be an era of kind of brutal American stroke Israeli domination of the region, with everybody having to fall into line? I mean, it's tricky, but we are seeing tectonic shifts going on, which, as I say, is very hard to predict how it's going to stabilize. It really is.
And the weird thing is that in the past, these extremist groups that sprung out of the Middle East and that were attacking American interests were always, putting Palestine at the center of their causes. But in recent years, that hasn't been the case at all. The Islamic State rarely spoke about Palestine, at least as far as I can recall, and is certainly not mounting any new attacks in their name. So where does any kind of pressure really on the United States come from to end its support for Israel? I don't really see it. I mean, even though there's a lot of, public opposition to the policy, it really hasn't made a huge difference ultimately, certainly not where I'm sitting in London.
No, I mean, there is very little pressure on America to curb its relationship with Israel. What there is sort of coming out of Gaza a bit. I mean, the American public is in favor, as far as I can gather from the polls, is in favor of a ceasefire and even of curbing weapons to Israel. But the Israeli lobby has worked extremely hard in Washington to make sure that it has the support of Congress for virtually anything it does. And the American public don't really have that much say. But that's a barrier that could potentially, change. The election is kind of on a knife edge, and places like Michigan, the Arab vote could be extremely important. So, it's not all one way, but there is this big thing that Congress, I mean, Netanyahu can go to Congress, have endless standing ovations for anything he says, while Obama or Biden or whoever sulks in the White House. I mean, it's an extraordinary situation where essentially Israel is using American money to pay for Congress, and they're all kind of applauding Israel because they all benefit. It's a quite extraordinary tail wagging dog situation that is unique, and I don't know if it's just going to persist forever. I really don't know, but it is a phenomenon.
But it's also well worth noting, of course, that this latest round of violence started because Hamas attacked Israel and killed a lot of innocent people on October 7th. So, yeah, but that didn't.
Yeah, of course, we have to remember that was.
There's a whole context to that. But in any case, the loss of innocent lives of civilians is always very tragic, and there seems to be no end to it. Jim Muir, thank you so very much for joining us here today, and stay safe and keep at it.
Good. Thank you, Amran. It's my pleasure.
And this brings us to the end of another episode of On the Middle East. I hope you found my conversation with Jim as enlightening as I did. Please go to our website, www.al-monitor.com, for more independent and in-depth analysis of the Middle East. Thank you and goodbye.